Hi everybody. We're going to take a minute or two and look at the EOS RP mirrorless camera that we use in Sequoit Media. It's probably the easiest to learn and in some ways the most powerful camera that we have, but it controls a little bit differently than the T6s you may have learned on. So I want to take a little while to show you just the basics of the controls. We're not going to go into everything the camera does. We're just going to go into the stuff you probably need to get out there and start shooting assignments for TomTom and Yearbook. All right, let's take a look. So it'll come in a bag, kind of like this. When you take it out, some of them have these straps which go over your shoulder. And the advantage of that kind of strap is that when you pull it up, the strap still stays down. It doesn't get in front of your face. Now, when you pick up one of these cameras, usually you'll have to get a battery as well. The batteries are in the battery charging stations. It goes in, there's battery, should say RP on it in little silver marker, and it goes right in this battery slot here. You pop it in, and then it pops, and it's in there. The memory card also goes in there. Cameras should all have the memory cards already in. Make sure that when you do copy pictures from the memory card to a computer, you put the card back in the camera. And that also pops in, it's spring-loaded. If you've got a lens with a lens hood on it, like this one, make sure that once you take it out of the bag, you remove the lens hood and place it back on the lens, facing out. It's facing in to make it easier to store in the bag. But when you stick it out like this, you've got a couple of inches sticking out to protect your lens from banging and stuff as you're carrying it around. It's an expensive piece of equipment, so we do what we can to make sure we don't smash it. All right, controls that you're probably going to use. This dial here is your shutter speed, and we'll look at that in a second. This controls your aperture. Some of them have, on the lenses, depending on which camera you have, you'll have 2 or 3 or even 1 ring on it. This one has 3. It's got the zoom ring here. Zoomed in, zoomed out. There's a little lock switch right there. Hit that lock switch to keep the lens from zooming in and out. That way it doesn't slowly kind of drag down as you're carrying it around. But if it's not moving, make sure your switch is off. Then this is your focus ring, which you'll almost never use because you have autofocus. So nobody manually focuses these things unless you absolutely have to. And then this is the control ring, which I've set to the ISO. So when you want to increase the ISO, you just turn it one way. And when you want to decrease the ISO, you turn it the other way. And we'll look at what all of that does in just a second. I'm going to pop this big guy on here. You'll never actually see this when you're working, but it lets me record what's going on in the camera screen, which will make it easier for me to show you how the controls work. All right, we are back now. So let's take a quick look at how the controls work in this camera. And first we're going to focus on exposure controls, and then we'll look a little bit at autofocus and stuff like that. So you have a bunch of different stuff here on the display. One thing you want to do is hit the info button to change what your display does. The info button's right here above this D-pad. So you hit info, and it takes everything away. Hit it again, and it shows you what would normally be on the back of a screen with a T6. Hit it again, it gives you some of the details, and then a little bit more details, and then with the histogram. And I know that this view blocks a lot of what you're looking at, but I prefer it because having that histogram on the screen makes it much easier to see exactly what your exposure is looking like. Now with this camera, whether you're looking at the back screen, which is disabled right now because I got the recorder plugged in, or you're looking through the viewfinder, you see the exact same thing. Both of them are video screens, which means that as you change your exposure, the picture actually gets brighter and darker and the histogram moves. So you get a much more accurate readout than the little light meter at the bottom. So let's take a look at how we would do that. Right now I'm at f4.5, 1/125th of a second at ISO 1600. So I'm going to drop my aperture down as open as it'll go by hitting this little dial here on my thumb. I drag that to the left, and you can see the f2.8 at the bottom. See it changing as the picture gets brighter and the histogram moves to the right. As it gets darker, the histogram moves to the left. So we're going to open that all the way up to f2.8. And then it's too bright now, so I'm going to increase my shutter speed using this dial on my finger right there. until I get a pretty good exposure. Around 1/400th of a second should be pretty safe. And that's decent for freezing like basketball and stuff like that. If you want to go even bright, you want to speed up that shutter speed even more, there's two ways to get that to happen by increasing your ISO. First is this control ring right here. You just crank it to the right and the ISO goes up. You could probably get away with even as high as 6400 ISO here, which would then allow you to increase the shutter speed to 1/1250th of a second, which is going to freeze anything that you encounter in the gym or any of those sports. The other thing you can do is where it says on the bottom of the screen ISO 6400, you can touch that on the touch screen and it'll pop up a little menu and you can just drag it using the touch screen there. Particularly for lenses that don't have the control ring on them, like the 85mm prime that we have on at least one of these cameras, that can be quite useful. So let's drop that down to 400 ISO, and then we'll go down to something like, that looks like a pretty good exposure there at 1/100th of a second. And then I'm going to increase my aperture again to, let's say f8, because I want to get more stuff in focus. Then I just drag my shutter speed down, and I'm back at 1/13th of a second, which with the stabilizer built into the lens, that might actually still be able to work. Yeah, it took 2 pictures, and they're sharp. All right, so now that we've got the basics of exposure, let's look at some of the other things you need to worry about. To bring up your quick menus, you hit this little Q button right here in the middle. And you can set up, we can look at our drive mode. Right now it's set to continue timer with 2 pictures. If you set it to low speed continuous tracking priority, what you get is when you're holding down the focus button, which is the AF on here. When you're holding that down and you're holding down the shutter button, which is on my finger here, it takes a series of pictures. And it's focusing, its priority is making sure that those pictures are in focus. If you switch to high speed continuous, then it's going to be a little sloppier about making sure everything's in focus, and you're going to get faster pictures. So you have to play with a little bit to decide what's going to work best in your circumstance. If things are running at you and the focus really has to keep up a lot, you probably don't want to do the high speed. You probably do the low speed. Then you can also set it to single shooting, which is you hold it down and you get 1 shot no matter how long you hold the button down. All right, so those are your drive modes there. Let's look at AF modes. Actually, let's talk about white balance first. So white balance up here is AWB, that's auto white balance. Anytime you're inside, I would recommend using AWB. It's pretty accurate and it does a really good job. If you're outside, maybe go to daylight if it's a bright sunny day, or if you want the colors a little bit warmer, go to cloudy. See how it's now warmer than it is with the daylight? That's daylight, shade, cloudy. Shady is even warmer than cloudy. So that's kind of one of the things that you can mess with when you want to make sure that your colors are coming out the way you want it to. When you want to check your colors, look through the viewfinder, because that's going to block out everything else and your eye's going to see more accurately what's actually going on there. All right, so now let's talk about focus. So the first option is auto with face tracking and eyeballs enabled. What it'll do is it basically, see how those little blue dots, blue squares, they're just picking something random. But if there's a face there, it's going to lock onto the nearest eyeball, which is great because that's what you want in focus for portraits. So for portraits and stuff, I'd highly recommend using this mode. It doesn't always pick up faces if they're wearing a mask though. So if it's COVID time and it's not grabbing the eye, don't use this because it'll pick up something random. If you need more accurate, if you want to do somebody's eye and it's just not doing it with the eye, then the 1 point is this tiny little square. You stick that where you want it to be in focus and it grabs it. To move the focus point around, you can drag your thumb on the screen if your face is right up to it, or you hit this button right here. And then you use the D-pad to move your focus point around. You can see you can pretty much move it anywhere you want in the screen. And then you just focus and it's there. The next one over is 1 point AF, which is the same as what we just looked at, just with a bigger point. So it's a little bit less accurate, but it's easier to use. And then expand area adds in some little squares around the square, so that if your subject moves out of the box for a little while, it'll still grab it in those squares, but it's prioritizing whatever's in the middle. Then the next one just gives you a little bit more leeway there, And then the final one gives you a bigger box, grabs whatever's in that box. And you can see it's got a bunch of autofocus points kind of in there. So sometimes that's actually a really good way if you've got something that's moving really fast and erratically and it's hard to get it. You just get it in this box and you're more likely to get your point nailed. So those are the main points that you need to think about with this camera. How to control the shutter speed with this dial, how to control the aperture with this one, how to control the ISO with this one. This control ring will be in a different place on different lenses, but that's where it is here. Remember to focus with the AF on button and change your focus point with the one just down and right from there. And that should give you a pretty good handle on how to use this camera. It's a lot of fun. It's easier to carry around than the other guys, and you get better image quality. So I think you're gonna have a blast with this. Enjoy.